Listen carefully, because the moment these words enter your mind, you step into a corridor most men never walk. A place built from sealed records, plantation whispers, and the kind of stories old families pretend never happened. If you feel the chill crawling up your spine already, good. That means you still have instincts. And you will need them. Because tonight, we descend into the life of a woman whose name was erased from her own bloodline. An heiress so wealthy, so insulated by her empire, that morality rotted away inside her like a locked room filled with stagnant air. Her story begins in 1835, but the sickness that drove her was older than the plantation walls, older than the slave economy, older than the empire her ancestors carved into the land with cruelty and polished silver. If you ever wondered what happens when power goes unchallenged, when a mind dissolves without consequences, when a person believes they can rewrite reality simply because no one around them is allowed to say no, you're about to see it. Not through legends, not through sensational tales, through the psychological blueprint she left behind. You see, her family's estate was not merely rich. It was unchallenged. And unchallenged power is not power. It is rot wearing a crown. The slaves on this estate whispered about her long before history buried her name. They spoke of a woman who drifted through the manor with parasitic hunger in her eyes, who believed she was born with a divine sanction to indulge every impulse, who treated human lives like ingredients in her private experiments of dominance and thrill. She weighed more than 600 pounds by the time she turned 27, not because of gluttony, but because she consumed everything around her: attention, obedience, secrets, and human fey. Her weight was a symbol of spiritual decay, a body mirroring a soul collapsing under the gravity of its own corruption. Rumors said she collected journals, detailed accounts of the people she manipulated, the servants she isolated, the rituals she invented to maintain control. Most were burned after her death. A few survived, hidden in archives labeled private memoranda. That is where this story comes from. So lean in. The descent begins now. And once you start, you don't climb back up unchanged. Before you judge her, understand this: monsters are not born. They are permitted. And this heiress, she was permitted everything. From the moment she could walk, the world bent its spine for her. Servants opened doors before she reached them. Teachers rewrote lessons to flatter her ego. Doctors lied to her face to avoid her wrath. Even her own parents, two pillars of Southern aristocracy, fed a delusion that she was something more than human, something chosen. They said she had a mind too sharp for limits, a spirit too fierce for restraint, and a destiny too grand for rules. That is how corruption begins, not with evil, but with permission. The plantation itself reflected this distortion. It was a kingdom built on silence, on the grinding machinery of exploitation, on the fear that lived inside every wooden beam. Whispers said the land groaned at night. Some said it remembered every cruelty committed upon it. Some said it kept score. The heiress inherited this empire at 16, and with it came absolute, undiluted authority over every living soul within its borders. But authority without accountability mutates the brain. It twists the nervous system. It alters the way a person perceives reality. By 20, she believed she was above consequence. By 23, she believed she was above morality. By 25, she believed she was above humanity itself. She began experimenting, not with science, but with control. She tested boundaries the way a child tests fire, pressing deeper into darkness just to feel something spark inside her again. She claimed she was studying obedience, measuring loyalty, refining hierarchy. But anyone who crossed her path understood the truth. She was dissecting Fae. She wanted to know how it moved, how it breathed, how it sounded when the human spirit cracked under pressure. Her journals, what little remains, describe exercises, where she forced servants into psychological traps, where she issued contradictions just to watch people panic, where she demanded displays of loyalty so unnatural that the mind warps trying to comprehend them. And yet, no one stopped her. Not the overseers, not the clergy, not the judges who visited for dinner and admired her family's contributions to the region. The institutions were rotten, and rotten institutions protect their own. But deeper than that, her cruelty was not random. It had a pattern, a rhythm, a hunger. She wasn't just breaking people. She was studying how they broke. And that, my friend, is where the real horror begins. There's a moment, silent, invisible, when a person crosses the threshold and becomes something else. Not fully human, not fully beast. Something colder, something engineered by power. For the heiress, that moment happened the night a storm cracked the sky open like a warning from God. Thunder rolled across the fields, but she remained awake, pacing the upper balcony of the manor, watching the enslaved cabins flicker with candlelight. In her surviving notes, she wrote, "Fear tastes different in a storm. More honest. More alive." Those words marked the shift, the beginning of her obsession. She started observing people the way a biologist dissects specimens, recording their reactions to threats, deprivation, and contradictions. She manipulated sleep cycles. She staged false emergencies. She whispered rumors between servants to ignite paranoia. She created invisible hierarchies, then tore them apart to watch alliances crumble. This was no longer cruelty for pleasure. This was methodology, a twisted science of domination. And slowly, the plantation became a laboratory. No one knew the rules. No one knew her motives. And fear, when constant, reshapes the human psyche more effectively than chains ever could. But here is the part most men never consider, and the part powerful institutions never teach. Domination is not about violence. It is about environment, about context, about psychology. When a person controls information, controls consequences, controls isolation, controls hope, they control the soul. And that was her genius. Her darkness had architecture, design, intention. By late 1834, the plantation wasn't just oppressive, it was theater. She orchestrated scenes like a puppeteer, moving people into roles they didn't choose. The betrayer, the loyalist, the coward, the hopeful, the doomed. She pushed her subjects to emotional extremes just to see what surfaced underneath. Some broke quietly, their spirits dissolving like paper in rain. Others resisted until their minds split from the pressure. A few became fiercely loyal, drawn to her manipulation like moths to flame, believing obedience could protect them. But she studied them all. Not out of curiosity, but out of hunger. She wanted to understand the mechanics of power at its darkest, purest root. And the deeper she went, the more the plantation whispered. Walls creaked at night. Servants swore footsteps followed them with no visible source. Animals refused to enter certain corridors. Even the overseers muttered that the air felt wrong. Because when a mind becomes a storm, the world around it bends. And hers was becoming a hurricane. By winter of 1834, her darkness no longer hid behind velvet curtains or polite southern smiles. It radiated from her, a slow, suffocating force that pressed against the walls of the estate like a rising tide. Visitors felt it instantly. A judge who dined there described the atmosphere as a house where the air knows something the people won't say. A traveling physician refused to stay the night, muttering that the manor was too alive in the wrong ways. Even her own relatives shortened their visits, citing indigestion, fatigue, urgent business, anything to escape the heaviness that clung to the halls like humidity. But what they felt wasn't supernatural. It was psychological, a field effect created by a mind that had grown too accustomed to absolute control. You've met people like this, not as extreme, but built from the same blueprint. People who distort rooms simply by entering them. People who make others shrink, hesitate, second-guess themselves without saying a word. People whose presence carries an unspoken command. She was that force, multiplied by wealth, isolation, and generational arrogance. And she used that force strategically. She learned that the greatest way to break a person was not to threaten them, but to make them fear losing something. Food, safety, favor, possibility, identity. So she built a system of rewards and punishments so unpredictable that no one could anchor themselves in certainty. One day she praised a servant for a trivial task. The next day she punished them for doing the same thing. Inconsistency is not chaos. It is the purest form of psychological control. When the rules keep shifting, a person loses the ability to trust their own judgment. Their mind drifts. Their confidence evaporates. Their sense of self fractures. This is how institutions break people. This is how empires maintain order. This is how tyrants operate, quietly, invisibly, without ever lifting a hand. And she understood this instinctively. Her journals from this period reveal her most chilling belief. The mind is a door. Fear is the key. I hold the key. She recorded reactions like data. Who cried? Who froze? Who obeyed? Who resisted? Who could be pushed further? Who needed to be replaced? It was not cruelty for pleasure anymore. It was research. A depraved thesis on human vulnerability. A study she conducted on living bodies under the guise of aristocratic privilege. And the plantation, that vast, fertile empire, became her classroom. There's a point where fear becomes atmosphere. Not an emotion, not a reaction, but a climate men breathe without noticing. By early 1835, that climate covered the entire plantation. Every path, every doorway, every conversation. Silence became the first language of the enslaved. Obedience became the second. And watching, always watching, became the third. Because the heiress had discovered a new obsession, surveillance. Not the crude kind, not guards or chains or locked doors, but something more elegant, more insidious, more ahead of its time. She weaponized information. Whispers, rumors, favors, confessions taken during moments of manipulation. She created an invisible web of eyes and ears by appointing trusted helpers, servants who believed they were being promoted, overseers who thought they had her favor, assistants who interpreted her slightest glance as divine instruction. But none of them realized they were being used. She recorded everything they said, everything they betrayed, every weakness they revealed. The plantation's hierarchy became an echo chamber of paranoia, a place where no one knew who was loyal, who was terrified, and who was informing to survive another day. This is the part men rarely understand. Control is not about force. Control is about uncertainty. When a man cannot predict consequences, he cannot form strategy. When he cannot form strategy, he cannot resist. And when he cannot resist, his will bends. Slowly, quietly, permanently. She learned this without teachers, without mentors, without studying philosophy or statecraft. She learned it because absolute power reveals the same truths to every mind arrogant enough to wield it. And that's the truth suppressed in polite history books, that the plantation system wasn't just an economic structure. It was a psychological machine, a testing ground for power, a place where elites perfected strategies of dominance long before those strategies seeped into institutions, corporations, governments, and the invisible systems we still live under today. But the heiress, she pushed these strategies further than most. She began staging scenes to test loyalty, manufacturing crises just to watch how people chose sides, sending conflicting orders to different overseers to see who would lie and who would confess, creating moral dilemmas with no correct answer so that every outcome incriminated someone. She wasn't just tightening control. She was sharpening her instincts, refining her ability to read people at their most vulnerable. And once she mastered reading people, she began reshaping them. Because to her, loyalty wasn't earned. It was engineered. Once she learned how to engineer loyalty, the plantation transformed again, this time into something colder, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She began isolating individuals, removing them from familiar patterns, separating them from the people who grounded them, assigning them new roles, new tasks, new positions within the hierarchy as if she were rearranging chess pieces on a bloodstained board. But this wasn't random. This was design. Her journals reveal a philosophy she developed during this period, a worldview built on 3 principles of domination: control the environment, control perception, control meaning. If you master those 3, you master people. Not just their actions, but their interpretations of their actions, their guilt, their hopes, their fears, their beliefs about themselves. She understood this with terrifying clarity. She manipulated time by waking certain servants at irregular hours, forcing them into a state of constant exhaustion that made obedience instinctive. She manipulated perception by staging overheard conversations, fake conflicts, fabricated betrayals, the illusion of favoritism, all engineered to destabilize relationships. She manipulated meaning by offering small rewards for acts she interpreted as loyal, even when the servant had no idea what they had done. The confusion wasn't a flaw in her system. It was the core of it. Intermittent reinforcement, the psychological principle casinos, social platforms, and governments would later perfect, was her personal discovery. A servant never knew what would earn approval, never knew what would bring punishment, never knew what version of the heiress they would meet. And so they clung to hope the way drowning men cling to driftwood. Hope, in the wrong hands, is not uplifting. It is suffocating. By mid-1835, she controlled not just behavior, but identity. People began describing themselves not by their own thoughts or desires, but by how she reacted to them. They became shadows of her interpretations, extensions of her will, fragments of a self they no longer trusted. This is the part that should disturb you, not the violence of her actions, but the precision. Her cruelty had rules, patterns, metrics, purpose. If history had not erased her, she would have become a case study in psychological domination centuries ahead of her time. But she didn't stop there, because once she mastered control of individuals, she turned her attention to controlling the collective mind of the plantation, a single will shaping an entire world. And that is where the true descent begins. Every tyrant eventually discovers a truth so intoxicating it becomes a turning point in their evolution. Controlling individuals is powerful, but controlling a collective is godlike. By late 1835, the heiress began treating the entire plantation not as a home, not as an estate, but as a living organism, one she intended to rewire from the inside out. She understood something most leaders never grasp. A group does not think like a collection of people. A group thinks like a single creature, with fears, instincts, and reflexes shaped by the environment around it. So she reshaped the environment. First, she altered routines. Daily tasks were reassigned without explanation. Work schedules shifted at random. Meals were delayed, changed, or canceled entirely. Uncertainty became the new law, and a mind without predictability searches desperately for someone to interpret reality for it. She positioned herself as that interpreter. Whenever confusion peaked, whenever the plantation felt on the brink of unraveling, she would emerge, calm, composed, the only person who seemed to understand the chaos she herself created. In that moment of collective fear, even those who despised her looked to her for direction. That is the essence of mass control. Create disorientation, then offer clarity. She also weaponized symbols. A gesture, a ribbon, a phrase, a shift in her wardrobe. Small things that gained enormous meaning because people believed they represented her mood, her attention, her future decisions. Her presence became a barometer everyone measured their fate against. This is how cults form, how movements rise, how regimes shape the emotional climate of millions. But on her plantation, it happened in miniature, a petri dish of authoritarian psychology. Then she took it further. She began staging events, faked illnesses, staged disputes among overseers, sudden changes in policies that lasted only days, eruptions of tension that appeared organic but were meticulously crafted. Each event pushed the plantation closer to a state of learned helplessness, that moment when a group collectively stops resisting because resistance seems impossible, or worse, irrelevant. And at the height of this tension, she introduced the final layer, division. She created factions, subgroups with different privileges, different expectations, different interpretations of her will. When a group is divided, its energy is spent inward, fighting shadows and rivals instead of resisting the true source of oppression. She stood above it all, untouched, watching her engineered ecosystem breathe fear in unison. And in her journals, she finally wrote the words that revealed her true intent. A world is not ruled by force. A world is ruled by atmosphere. And I am the weather. By the beginning of autumn, the plantation wasn't merely controlled, it was conditioned. A closed ecosystem circulating the same patterns of fear and dependency like blood moving through a diseased body. And she, the heiress, sat at its heart like a dark pulse, dictating the rhythm. But something else began to grow during this time, something that unsettled even her. The land itself started to respond. Call it superstition, call it intuition, call it the consequence of human suffering seeping into soil and wood until the world begins to echo it back. But the atmosphere thickened. Not metaphorically, tangibly. Servants said the air felt heavier near the manor. Chimneys coughed black smoke that never fully dispersed. Doors swelled in their frames as though the house were breathing oddly. Animals refused to drink from the well near the old magnolia tree. The overseers joked about it at first. Then they stopped joking. And the heiress, instead of fearing this shift, became fascinated by it. She spent hours walking the perimeter of the estate, dragging her fingers along rotting railings, studying cracks in the walls, observing the slightest change in temperature or scent. She wrote notes obsessively, pages filled with sketches, symbols, phrases like, Pain leaves residue. Control has a frequency. The house remembers. What frightened everyone else thrilled her. Because she believed she was witnessing the next stage of her experiment, the environment adapting to her will. But she was wrong. The environment was not bending to her power. It was mirroring it, reflecting it, amplifying it. When a leader rules through fear, the domain becomes saturated with fear. When they rule through chaos, their world becomes unstable. When they rule through suffering, the world around them absorbs the suffering like a sponge soaking up blood. And that has consequences. People on the plantation began having the same dreams, shadows gliding across the fields, whispers coming from empty rooms, figures standing in corners that vanished when approached. Not supernatural, just a byproduct of minds pushed to the brink of fragmentation. Fear makes imagination feral. But there was one dream nearly everyone shared, a figure sitting in a massive chair, breathing heavily, surrounded by flickering lights that weren't candles and weren't fire. Everyone knew who the figure was. They just didn't understand the lights. The heiress did. Or at least, she believed she did. She interpreted the dreams as confirmation that her influence had reached the subconscious, that she had penetrated the deepest layer of the human mind. And in a way, she had. But she mistook their collective fear for collective worship, and that miscalculation was the beginning of her unraveling. Fear can unify a population, but only for so long. Eventually, it begins to curdle, thickening into something unstable, unpredictable, and volatile. By late 1835, the heiress believed she stood at the peak of her power. Her journals radiated arrogance, pages filled with proclamations like, "Their dreams bend toward me. Their instincts save me. Their minds orbit my gravity." She mistook compliance for devotion and silence for loyalty. But while she fine-tuned her empire of psychological control, something else was happening beneath the surface. A collective shift she was too intoxicated by her own intellect to notice. People had stopped fearing her. Not because she was less threatening, but because they had grown numb. Trauma has a saturation point. After enough exposure, the mind begins to malfunction in ways no tyrant anticipates. Some servants moved like ghosts, taking orders automatically without emotional resistance, empty vessels with hollow eyes. She mistook this for success. In reality, they were beyond her reach, beyond anyone's reach. Others developed a strange calmness, a quiet internal rebellion. Not defiance, but detachment. The kind that comes when a person decides they have nothing left to lose. And a few, just a few, began thinking together, whispering in the dark, not about escape, not about justice, but about survival strategy. Fear had linked their minds, and shared suffering had synchronized their instincts. They were no longer isolated. They were networked, connected through unspoken rules and silent glances and the mutual understanding that the heiress was not a goddess, just a woman rotting from the inside. But her arrogance blinded her. When she noticed the plantation growing quieter, she interpreted it as submission. When she saw fewer emotional breakdowns, she interpreted it as stability. When she sensed the atmosphere changing, she thought the house was aligning with her will. No, it was bracing against her. The land, the walls, the corridors, the people, everything had begun to shift into a state of pressure, a tension so compressed that the smallest spark could turn the entire state into a storm. And that spark came when one of her most trusted monitors, a servant she believed perfectly conditioned, failed to report a piece of information. It was a tiny act, a single omission, barely perceptible, but it was the first fracture in the system she built. And once a fracture appears in a structure of fear, the whole thing starts to tremble. Fractures are invisible at first. A crack in a wall, a whisper unreported, a glance that lingers too long. Nothing seems catastrophic. But under pressure, even the smallest fissure widens. It spreads, imperceptibly at first, then with unstoppable force. The heiress never saw it coming. She assumed control was eternal. She assumed fear was indestructible. She assumed loyalty could be engineered perfectly. But she had miscalculated the human element. Humans, even broken, even terrorized, carry an instinct for subtle rebellion, a flicker of autonomy, a quiet refusal. And when those flickers multiply, they become a storm. The first warning was silence. Her monitors stopped reporting faithfully. Tasks were completed late, or not at all. Subtle mistakes appeared in her schedules and plans, not from negligence, but from a mind-assating independence. She interpreted this as chaos, and chaos, in her mind, demanded control. She increased her interventions. She intensified surveillance. She staged new crises to test loyalty. She experimented more aggressively, more obsessively. But every intervention created tension. Every test deepened mistrust. Every punishment widened the emotional rift. And the plantation, once obedient, now existed in a state of pressure without release. The very air vibrated with unspoken rebellion. The shadows thickened. The servants moved as though they were rehearsing invisible steps for an act they hadn't yet written. Her paranoia grew in tandem. She saw betrayal where none existed. She imagined plots where none had formed. She began to micromanage small details with obsessive precision, but the large fractures, the network of shared consciousness she had failed to recognize, remained invisible to her. She was fighting ghosts of her own creation. Constructs she had built from fear, isolation, and manipulation were now circling her like predators, observing her, waiting for her to stumble. And stumble she would. Because absolute control is an illusion. Power is never perfected. It is tested. And those who believe they have mastered the test rarely survive the consequences. The heiress, drunk on her own genius, was approaching the ultimate test. The test she did not design. The test she could not predict. A subtle alliance had formed. Quiet, disciplined, invisible. A network of minds no longer trapped, no longer afraid, waiting for the signal to reclaim their world. And the signal was about to come. The signal arrived as all revolutions do. Small, almost imperceptible, yet explosive in consequence. A forgotten journal, misplaced in the chaos of her own experiments, surfaced in the hands of those she believed loyal. A single entry she had written, detailing schedules, manipulations, and private judgments, became a blueprint. Not for obedience, for liberation. It was ironic, almost poetic. Her meticulous records, meant to consolidate control, now empowered the very people she sought to dominate. Every observation, every experiment, every note on human behavior became fuel for their strategy. By now, the plantation had become a web of observation, where every servant, overseer, and subordinate knew the hierarchy and its cracks. They studied her as she had studied them. They learned her patterns, her reactions, her obsessions. They understood what made her anxious, what made her overreact, what made her arrogant, and how to exploit it. She remained unaware. She believed she was omniscient, that her presence alone commanded compliance. But the seeds of insurrection had already taken root, and like a storm brewing unseen, it began to spread. Quiet whispers became synchronized movements. Minor acts of defiance, deliberate errors, delayed tasks, hidden communications, accumulated. A rhythm developed, an invisible choreography designed to test her, to see whether she was as invulnerable as she believed. The heiress, consumed by her own obsession with control, mistook the tension for submission. Her paranoia only intensified. She doubled down on manipulation, creating more crises, more contradictions, more confusion. And in doing so, she unwittingly accelerated the collapse. Every psychological trap she set became a mirror, reflecting back her own fears. Every experiment she conducted was reproposed against her. She had built an empire on fear. And now, fear was fighting back. By mid-1835, the plantation existed in a state of suspended tension. No one acted openly, but everyone acted in secret. And the heiress, in her arrogance, remained blind to the invisible network forming beneath her. This is the moment where history rarely dares to pay, the apex of power and its silent undoing. The heiress was still alive, still commanding, still appearing untouchable, and yet, her world had already begun to unravel. Because absolute dominion, no matter how meticulously engineered, cannot withstand the subtle, synchronized force of minds that refuse to be bent. And soon, that force would speak. It would act. It would reclaim what had been stolen. And the heiress would finally confront the consequences of her obsession. By late 1835, the heiress' confidence had reached its apex. She walked the halls with the certainty of a sovereign, believing that fear had solidified into obedience, that no one could outmaneuver her, that she had engineered a world entirely under her command. But power is a living thing. It is never static. It responds to resistance. It adapts. It betrays those who assume it is permanent. The first subtle warning was a mistake she attributed to incompetence. An order left unexecuted, a task improperly completed. She chastised the servant publicly, expecting immediate submission. Instead, the servant looked at her calmly, not with fear, not with defiance, but with quiet calculation. Her stomach sank. A pattern she thought she controlled had shifted. A rhythm she believed predictable was broken. And yet she dismissed it, too arrogant, too absorbed in her own genius to see the magnitude of the error. But her monitors noticed. Her network of spies, once perfectly obedient, was now subtly altering information, shifting reports, omitting critical details, silently coordinating. The heiress believed she still commanded reality. She believed her manipulations were absolute. She believed her empire was impenetrable. And that is when the first symbolic acts appeared. Small, almost invisible, but intentional. Doors left unlocked. Schedules misaligned. Orders delayed. A misplacement here, a misdirection there. A web of micro-dissidents that went unnoticed by the untrained eye. She did not see the network forming, the invisible alliances she had unwittingly allowed. And yet, it was there, a silent force, bound together by shared observation, shared suffering, and the tacit understanding that her empire was not eternal. History often masks the subtlety of insurrection. It prefers dramatic finales, burning buildings, bloody uprisings, explosions of visible rebellion. But some revolutions occur quietly, meticulously, like shadows merging into a single shape, like a pressure building so steadily that when it finally releases, it cannot be ignored. And that release was approaching. The heiress, intoxicated by her own mastery, was blind to the forces moving beneath her feet. She believed she was untouchable. She believed fear had forged her kingdom eternal. But fear is fragile, and those who wield it recklessly rarely recognize when it turns on them. Her descent into chaos had begun, and the first fractures were about to become avalanches. The collapse began not with a confrontation, but with timing. A single night when the heiress had miscalculated the rhythm of her empire, when her attention was focused elsewhere, and the invisible network she had fostered finally synchronized. It started with small acts of defiance, tasks executed incorrectly, not out of negligence, but strategy, errors that looked accidental but were deliberate, delays that seemed coincidental but were orchestrated. By morning, these acts had multiplied. The entire plantation began to shift subtly, imperceptibly. Orders that once flowed smoothly now faltered. Communication lines fractured. Her carefully constructed system of control began to stutter. And she noticed. The heiress, so meticulous, so attuned to every detail, felt the first inkling of panic. The pulse of her empire had changed. The invisible web she believed she controlled was moving against her. And yet, she still did not fully understand what was happening. She lashed out. Small manipulations, sudden punishments, abrupt shifts in expectations, trying to restore equilibrium. But each intervention accelerated the instability. The psychological ecosystem she had engineered could not adapt fast enough. The human element she had underestimated was proving far more resilient than she imagined. Her manipulations had created not obedience, but awareness, a network of minds capable of subtle resistance. And with awareness comes coordination. By noon, the first open act occurred. A group of servants refused an order outright. Not in rebellion, not in violence, but in silence. A silent, coordinated pause that rippled through the estate. She interpreted this as disobedience, as betrayal. She stormed the halls, issuing commands, threatening punishment. And yet, every response she provoked only reinforced their unity. She realized, slowly, that her empire was no longer under her control. The fear she had relied upon had lost its grip. The chaos she had created was no longer hers to direct. This is the exact moment history calls the turning point. The precise instant when absolute dominion encounters the ungovernable human spirit. For the first time, she was truly afraid. Not a manufactured fear. Not a fear she could manipulate, but a deep, instinctual terror. The kind that creeps into your bones and whispers that your world is slipping away. And once terror becomes real, it cannot be negotiated, engineered, or dismissed. The heiress empire was crumbling. Her illusions of invincibility were shattering. And the lessons she had so meticulously extracted from others were now being applied to her. The first stage of reckoning had begun. Once fear turns inward, it becomes something far more dangerous than any external threat. The heiress, accustomed to being the wielder of terror, now found herself subject to it. Every glance, every misstep, every silence became a potential sign of betrayal. Her mind, once sharp and precise, began to twist under the weight of paranoia. She monitored faces, footsteps, and whispers with obsessive intensity, trying desperately to regain the rhythm of control she had lost. But the network of silent resistance moved faster than her awareness. Small acts multiplied, subtle gestures communicated strategy, and the very people she had meticulously manipulated began operating in sync against her. She attempted to reassert dominance through spectacle. Public reprimands, abrupt punishments, and orchestrated crises were deployed with ruthless efficiency. She expected immediate submission. She expected fear to restore order. She expected obedience to bend reality back into alignment. It did not. Instead, every act of cruelty, every display of power, reinforced the unity she could not see. The servants, the overseers, the silent allies, each understood the rules she believed she controlled, and they exploited them. By nightfall, the heiress was isolated. Even those who had once been her closest monitors kept their distance. They appeared obedient, but beneath the surface, they coordinated. They withheld information. They subtly redirected her attention. They allowed her to believe she was still orchestrating events, while in reality, the plantation was moving according to its own new logic. The heiress' body, already immense, heavy, and symbolic of her inner corruption, began to reflect her unraveling mind. Sleep eluded her. Food lost appeal. Her once commanding presence now carried tension, uncertainty, and visible anxiety. The house itself seemed to respond. Doors creaked in response to her footsteps. Shadows lingered longer than they should. The candlelight flickered unnaturally in corners. Even the animals seemed attuned to the shift, skittish and unpredictable. She had created an ecosystem of control, and now the ecosystem had turned predator. Her journals, once confident and omniscient, began to reflect doubt, fear, and fragmentation. Pages filled with frantic notes, scribbled symbols, and questions she could not answer. Why are they not afraid? What have I missed? How can I bend them again? The irony was inescapable. She had spent years studying the mechanics of fear, the psychology of obedience, and the subtle architecture of control. And now, she was being subjected to the very principles she had perfected. The heiress had reached the point every manipulator eventually faces, the moment when their own tools are turned against them. And the reckoning, though invisible, was imminent. By winter of 1835, the heiress world had transformed into a subtle, unrelenting trap, crafted not by a single person, but by the very network she had sought to dominate. She moved through the halls expecting obedience, but met compliance that was empty, hollow, strategic. The servants and overseers no longer reacted. They anticipated, adjusted, and manipulated in ways she could not perceive. She began to question herself. A thought she had never permitted. Am I losing control? That question alone was catastrophic. Fear of losing power is worse than fear of punishment. It is destabilizing, corrosive, and paralyzing. It seeps into every decision, every glance, every movement. And once doubt takes hold, it spreads like a virus, infecting the mind with chaos. She tried to tighten her grip. Orders became more erratic, punishments more severe, crises staged more dramatically. But every intervention had the opposite effect. The network learned faster than she could adapt. Her strategies were anticipated. Her actions became predictable. The heiress began to notice small anomalies, conversations she hadn't overheard, tasks delayed just enough to create tension, an alignment of eyes in rooms she thought were isolated. Her paranoia escalated. She saw plots in innocuous gestures, betrayal in silence, enemies in those who were never opposed. She became a prisoner of her own designs, trapped in the very web she had woven. And yet, the invisible force kept its distance. There was no open confrontation, no defiance in the streets, no bloody uprisings, only coordination, only pressure, only a quiet, inescapable truth. Her empire of fear was fragile, and she had overestimated her own genius. At night, she would pace the corridors, listening to the whispers of the estate, not realizing they were whispers of planning, not of complaint. She recorded frantic notes, diagrams, and symbols, trying to regain the map of control she once had. But the map no longer existed. By now, even the environment seemed conspiratorial. The walls, the shadows, the flickering candlelight, all mirrors of her unraveling psyche. The air itself carried the tension she could not manage. The heiress had become a student of her own fear, a subject in the experiment she had created. And this, my friend, is the moment where the story pivots. The invisible system she thought she mastered was about to speak, and what it had to say would not be gentle. This is the point where the invisible becomes visible. By early 1836, the heiress' obsession with control had reached a fever pitch. Every action, every decision, every glance was scrutinized, by her, and by those who had quietly learned to anticipate her. Her empire, once a carefully balanced system of fear and obedience, had evolved into something she no longer fully commanded. The first cracks had widened into chasms. Minor acts of defiance grew into coordinated maneuvers. Small errors were no longer random, they were deliberate, tactical, executed with precision. The servants, overseers, and even peripheral witnesses had become a single organism, moving in synchrony beneath her awareness. She believed she could predict their behavior. She believed she could manipulate the patterns, bend them back into submission. But the human element, the one variable she had studied endlessly, was now weaponized against her. And then came the symbolic act, the moment that would forever mark the plantation's history, and the heiress unraveling. A hidden signal, something as simple as a specific phrase spoken twice, a gesture repeated, a subtle alignment of objects, activated the network she had unknowingly created. The plantation itself became a theater of coordination. Every individual, every movement, every glance, now operated in unison. She had created a system to dominate minds, and the system had learned how to resist. Her journals reveal the panic that followed. I see them. I see their unity. I do not understand it. She scribbled diagrams, timelines, and hypothetical outcomes, trying to map something she could no longer measure. By now, she had lost the most important thing a tyrant ever possesses, the illusion of invincibility. Fear, once a tool she wielded with precision, had turned inward. It gnawed at her certainty. It fractured her perception of reality. It forced her to question herself, her own judgments, her own sanity. At this stage, the observers, those she thought powerless, had claimed the psychological high ground. Every reaction she triggered was anticipated. Every attempt at manipulation was counted. The plantation was no longer hers. It was a machine operating according to its own rhythm, and she was trapped inside it. This is a lesson history seldom records. Absolute dominion can be undone without violence. Silent coordination, shared awareness, and patient strategy can dismantle even the most tyrannical power. And here's where you, the observer, must take notice. Because half of understanding power is recognizing when it turns against you, and the other half is knowing how to align yourself with forces you cannot see. If you understand, comment the phrase "the shadows are my allies" twice. Lock it in. Mark yourself. Because comprehension transforms identity. The heiress had ignored this principle, and now, she was paying the price. Once the network activated, the heiress' carefully constructed world began to fracture at lightning speed. Every command she issued met subtle, invisible resistance. Every glance she cast carried the tension of anticipation she no longer controlled. Her once loyal monitors had become agents of silent defiance. Tasks were delayed, misinterpreted, and reproposed to undermine her authority. And yet, nothing was overt, nothing she could punish. She began to panic. Her journals from this period reveal a mind spiraling into obsession. They move as one. I see them, and yet I cannot reach them. Every action I take is mirrored, distorted. The air itself conspires against me. This was not chaos. This was coordination. A network of minds, trained by fear, rebellion, and survival instinct, acting in perfect synchrony to destabilize her dominion. Her paranoia intensified. She suspected betrayal everywhere. She watched shadows for signs, listened to silence for confessions. But the true genius of the rebellion lay in its subtlety. The servants and overseers had learned to act like obedient extensions of her will while secretly subverting her power at every opportunity. By now, the plantation itself seemed to resist her. Doors refused to close. Objects shifted subtly. Even animals reacted unpredictably. She interpreted these anomalies as evidence of supernatural forces, but they were merely reflections of the tension she had imposed on her environment, amplified by the human network she could no longer see. The heiress became obsessive, checking, rechecking, interrogating, orchestrating new manipulations to reclaim the sense of control slipping through her fingers. Her weight, already immense, grew heavier, a physical manifestation of her psychological collapse. She became a prisoner in her own home, ensnared in the system she had created, unable to distinguish cause from effect. And here's the paradox every student of power must recognize. The more tightly you try to grip control, the faster it can slip through your hands. By the time night fell on that fateful winter evening, the heiress was exhausted, destabilized, and alone. She no longer commanded fear. She had become its prey, and the invisible network beneath her waited silently, ready to strike at the exact moment she overextended. This is where history rarely provides detail, because it is almost impossible to describe the collapse of a tyrant without violence. But here, the tyranny fell quietly, psychologically, irreversibly, and in that silence, the heiress would finally face a truth she had long ignored, that domination is never absolute, and the human spirit, when united, cannot be bent indefinitely. By the following morning, the heiress' domain had shifted beneath her without a single overt act of rebellion. She awoke with the weight of suspicion pressing on her chest. The whole she had ruled with certainty now felt foreign, the air thick with a tension she could neither manipulate nor predict. Her servants moved with mechanical precision, but each step, each glance, carried an invisible message she could not decode. Her paranoia intensified. She suspected every corner, every shadow, every sound. Her once dominant presence began to crack. Her empire of fear, carefully cultivated for years, now fostered mistrust in herself. Every glance that once signaled submission now hinted at collusion. Every whispered conversation, every delayed action was a potential threat. And yet, outwardly, nothing had changed. The plantation appeared orderly. The crops were tended. The chores were completed. The hierarchy remained intact. But beneath the surface, the power had shifted. The invisible network, built on subtle observation, shared suffering, and learned anticipation, was now the true authority. They moved as one organism, silent, coordinated, and lethal in precision. No open confrontation, no defiance, no chaos, just an elegant, unbreakable system operating under her nose. The heiress attempted to reassert dominance. She staged crises, demanded explanations, increased punishments, and orchestrated manipulations. Each attempt, however, revealed the depth of her miscalculation. Her interventions were anticipated, counted, and rendered ineffective. She was trapped in a psychological snare of her own creation. By midday, exhaustion and fear consumed her. She no longer trusted her own mind. She questioned motives, misinterpreted signals, and doubted her memory. The very strategies she had perfected to manipulate others now ensnared her psyche. Her journals became frantic, filled with fragmented thoughts, scribbled diagrams, and desperate pleas for clarity. I see them everywhere. They move as one. I cannot predict them. I am losing everything I built. It was the perfect inversion. The heiress had spent years mastering fear, control, and manipulation. Now, those same mechanisms had turned inward, consuming her mind, destabilizing her perception, and stripping her of the certainty that had once defined her. The plantation, silent and deceptively obedient, had become a weapon aimed directly at her sanity. And in the quiet, subtle orchestration of the oppressed, the heiress would learn the most brutal lesson. Control is never yours to keep. Fear is never absolute. And even the most powerful can be undone without a single act of violence. By the end of that day, the heiress had become acutely aware of a fundamental truth. She was no longer the master of her domain. Everything she had built, every system of obedience, every carefully orchestrated crisis, every psychological trap, was still in place, yet it no longer answered to her. Her empire had become a machine that moved independently, guided by the subtle intelligence of those she had sought to dominate. The heiress attempted to rationalize it. She believed her spies had failed. She believed someone had betrayed her. She believed the universe itself was conspiring. But none of these explanations captured the truth. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. She had underestimated the human capacity for silent resistance. The servants and overseers had developed a network, one she had unknowingly seeded with the very skills she had used to control them. Observation, calculation, anticipation, subtle manipulation, all traits she cultivated, were now weaponized against her. Every movement she made, every reaction she displayed, every moment of arrogance was catalogued, interpreted, and counted. She moved through the manor, attempting to assert dominance. Commands issued with the authority of a sovereign fell flat. Tasks were executed, yes, but in a manner that subtly undermined her authority. Orders were obeyed, yet their execution reversed the intended effect. The plantation ran smoothly, but under new rules she could not perceive. Her paranoia became a daily companion. She saw plots where none existed. She suspected allies, condemned innocents, and punished misperceived betrayals. Every attempt to regain control only accelerated her isolation. The more she tried to dominate, the more the network adjusted, absorbing her tactics and countering them without confrontation. By nightfall, exhaustion overtook her. Her body ached. Her mind raced uncontrollably. Sleep was impossible, for even in dreams she observed shadows moving strategically, whispering plans she could not interpret. The very house seemed alive with intent, mirroring the psychological web that now held her captive. And in that quiet, the heiress finally understood. Her years of psychological mastery had created something she could never command. She had studied fear, manipulation, and domination, but never resistance born of coordination and subtlety. Power, she realized too late, is fragile. Absolute dominion is an illusion. Even the most meticulously crafted systems can collapse from within, guided by patient minds who refuse to bend. And in that revelation lay a truth men seldom face. Control can be stripped silently, invisibly, without a single sword drawn, without a single drop of blood spilled. Her empire of fear had become her prison, and the first stage of total collapse was now inevitable. The next morning, the heiress awoke with a heightened sense of dread. She warped the halls with the expectation that her commands would restore order. But each response from her servants and overseers reinforced a terrifying reality. The plantation was no longer hers. Every movement she made was anticipated. Every instruction she gave was interpreted and counted subtly, invisibly. The network she had unintentionally fostered moved like a single organism, synchronized, disciplined, and patient. They did not defy her openly. They never had to. Their obedience was a weapon, their silence a shield, their calculated compliance a trap. She attempted to assert authority through spectacle, a sudden inspection, a harsh reprimand, a dramatic display of power. She believed the theatrics would reset the hierarchy, that fear would once again bend the collective will. It did not. Every act of control was absorbed, catalogued, and reproposed against her. Her empire ran, yes, but not according to her intent. By noon, exhaustion had taken root. The heiress' mind raced with frantic calculations, trying to outmaneuver forces she could not see. Her journals, once confident and commanding, now reflected terror and doubt. They anticipate me. They are everywhere. I do not know where I end and they begin. Am I still in control, or have I been consumed? The physical environment mirrored her unraveling. Doors creaked in ways that seemed intentional. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Even the flicker of candlelight seemed conspiratorial. The air, heavy and charged, was suffused with the tension of minds in silent coordination. By evening, the heiress' paranoia had escalated to obsession. Every glance became a threat, every whisper a conspiracy. She interrogated, manipulated, punished, always one step behind an intelligence she had underestimated. Her own mastery of fear and control had trained the very people who now neutralized her. And here's the lesson hidden in history. Absolute power is always contingent. No matter the cruelty, no matter the resources, no matter the brilliance of control, human ingenuity and unity can dismantle tyranny silently, invisibly, without violence. The heiress, in her arrogance, failed to see the principle she had unknowingly created. When fear becomes too precise, too engineered, it breeds resistance. By nightfall, the first real opportunity for the network to act presented itself. The heiress, oblivious to the looming consequence, believed she was still orchestrating reality. But reality, as she had learned too late, had begun to move independently. And soon, the first visible fracture of her empire would appear. The first visible fracture came not with violence, but with timing and subtle coordination. It began with a single overseer, one she had believed perfectly loyal, deliberately delaying a routine inspection. Nothing overt, nothing dangerous. But in the context of the invisible network, it was a signal, a calculated ripple through the plantation, a demonstration of autonomy, a proof that the invisible force she had underestimated could now act with precision. The heiress noticed the delay and reacted immediately. Anger, confusion, a demand for explanation. But her words fell flat. The overseer responded with polite compliance, yet every action subtly contradicted her intent. Tasks were completed, but in a way that weakened her control rather than restored it. By mid-morning, the ripple had spread. Small deviations appeared throughout the estate, chores performed incorrectly, timings altered, reports misfiled. Not rebellion, not chaos. Subtle, deliberate recalibration of power. She attempted to counter it, staging crises, punishing errors, imposing arbitrary rules. But each intervention only highlighted the growing sophistication of the network. Her strategies, perfected over years, were anticipated, neutralized, or inverted. The heiress was no longer in control. She was observing the consequences of her own creation. Paranoia consumed her. She questioned motives, doubted her own perceptions, and isolated herself further. The plantation, which had once been a reflection of her will, was now a mirror of her fate. The shadows in the corners of rooms, the slight hesitation in responses, the alignment of objects she hadn't moved, all whispered that her power was slipping. And yet, the heiress remained blind to the true scope of the resistance. She could see the fractures but not the architecture behind them. The network she had inadvertently nurtured was synchronized, disciplined, patient. It acted invisibly, yet with precision. No defiance needed. No violence necessary. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into her body and mind. She realized, too late, that fear, even when meticulously engineered, has a breaking point. And once that point is reached, it is no longer fear that dictates action, but collective strategy, patience, and silent coordination. The heiress empire of terror had begun to crumble. Not from open revolt, not from force, but from the subtle intelligence of those she sought to dominate. The quiet, patient, invisible resistance was about to reveal its full power. The quiet resistance escalated methodically, like a shadow stretching across the sun, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. By this stage, the heiress no longer trusted her own perceptions. Every step she took through the halls was measured, cautious, paranoid. Every glance at her servants, every conversation, every demand was filtered through a lens of fear. She suspected treachery everywhere, and yet, she could not identify the source. The network she had inadvertently nurtured operated in perfect silence. Errors were calculated, timing precise, and coordination flawless. Every act of obedience masked a subtle subversion. Her orders were followed, but the outcomes always shifted the balance of power away from her. She attempted to regain dominance through spectacle, public humiliation, arbitrary punishment, sudden and irrational changes to schedules and routines. The heiress believed these acts would reset the hierarchy. Instead, they highlighted the mastery of those who moved unseen. By mid-afternoon, the plantation seemed normal on the surface. The work continued. The hierarchy appeared intact. But beneath, the invisible web of resistance had woven a new order. Her empire ran, yes, but according to rules she did not write. Her journals now brimmed with fragmented thoughts, frantic sketches, and desperate questions. Why do they anticipate me? Why does the air feel aligned against me? Have I created something I cannot command? The heiress had mastered control over individuals, but she had underestimated the power of collective strategy. Those who seemed powerless were now agents of subtle revolution. Their patience rivaled her own. Their coordination exceeded what she could imagine. By evening, exhaustion and terror had fused. Sleep eluded her. The manor seemed alive, aware, responsive. Shadows appeared where none should have existed. Footsteps echoed when no one walked. The air was heavy with the unspoken intelligence of those she sought to dominate. And the most terrifying realization, this resistance required no violence. It required no open confrontation, no uprising, no sword or gun. All it required was awareness, patience, and subtle coordination, tools the heiress herself had trained her subjects to master. Her empire, once a carefully engineered machine of fear, was now a trap of her own making. She had become the subject of the very psychology she perfected, and the inevitable collapse, the reckoning, was approaching with silent, unstoppable precision. By nightfall, the heiress paranoia had become almost tangible. Every shadow was a threat. Every whisper was a conspiracy. Every footstep might signal betrayal. Her empire, once alive with the rhythm of fear she orchestrated, now pulsated with resistance she could not perceive. And she was trapped within it, like a predator caught in its own snare. The invisible network she had inadvertently cultivated continued to move with precise coordination. Orders were followed, yet their execution subtly undermined her authority. Minor delays, overlooked details, misaligned tasks, all calculated to erode her power without drawing attention. She saw anomalies but could not comprehend their pattern. Her attempts to reassert control became frantic. She staged dramatic inspections, imposed sudden changes, and punished perceived disobedience. Every act, meticulously crafted, backfired in ways she could not anticipate. Her obsession with control, her arrogance, and her blind spots became tools in the hands of those she had oppressed. By midnight, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She could no longer think clearly. Sleep was impossible. Her thoughts spiraled. They move as one. They anticipate me. Am I losing myself? Am I losing everything? Even the environment seemed to conspire against her. Doors that once responded easily now stuck or swung open without reason. Shadows lingered longer than possible. The flicker of candlelight seemed to point to corners she dared not enter. Even the animals reacted differently, skittish and unpredictable. Her journals, once confident and meticulous, became frantic scribbles. Symbols, diagrams, fragmented sentences, and repetitive warnings filled the pages. Her mind, trained to manipulate others, was now manipulated by the very system she had created. She had underestimated one critical principle. Fear can be anticipated, predicted, and coordinated against. She had trained minds to obey through terror, but she had never trained them to fail silently. And in that failure, the seeds of rebellion had matured into a force she could not perceive. This stage of the story reveals a chilling truth about control. You can dominate minds, but you cannot dominate awareness. The very intelligence, observation, and adaptability you cultivate in others can turn against you. The heiress, drunk on her own genius, had created her own undoing, and the invisible network she ignored was ready to act. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It had become inevitable, and the heiress had yet to understand the full scale of the storm closing in around her. By the early hours of the morning, the heiress had become a shadow of her former self. Her body, already immense and commanding, now carried the weight of fear and obsession. Her mind, once a precise instrument of calculation and manipulation, was fractured. She wandered the halls of her estate, listening for whispers that were not there, watching shadows that were not moving, searching for betrayals that were invisible. The invisible network beneath her continued its quiet orchestration. They moved as one organism, synchronized and patient, executing subtle acts that destabilized her authority without confrontation. Her orders were obeyed, but their outcomes now served the resistance rather than her will. Her paranoia escalated. Every glance from a savant, every misaligned object, every hesitation became evidence of conspiracy. She interrogated, punished, and manipulated, always one step behind an intelligence she had underestimated. The empire she had built to control minds now controlled her. By dawn, exhaustion and terror had fused in her body. Sleep had become impossible. Her journals, once filled with confident observations, now contained frantic scribbles, repetitive warnings, and fragmented diagrams. I see them everywhere. They anticipate me. I am losing control. Am I still myself? Even the environment seemed aligned against her. Doors resisted her touch. Shadows lingered unnaturally. Candlelight flickered with unnatural intention. The air felt charged, suffused with the pressure of minds moving invisibly yet in perfect coordination. The heiress had made a critical miscalculation. She believed fear could be perfected, controlled, and maintained indefinitely. She had never accounted for the collective intelligence born of silent observation and patient resistance. Her own mastery of psychology had trained the very people now undermining her, allowing them to operate invisibly, unpredictably, and irreversibly. This is the principle she would never learn in time. Control, when absolute, breeds resistance. Obedience, when enforced through terror, becomes a training ground for subversion. And tyranny, no matter how meticulously designed, is fragile when the oppressed move as one. By mid-morning, the first overt consequence of this invisible resistance was imminent. The heiress, still blind to the full scope of the network, continued to operate under the illusion of command. But the cracks she had ignored for years were now gaping fractures, ready to consume the empire she believed was eternal. And in that fragile, tense silence, the next stage of reckoning was about to begin. By mid-morning, the plantation was a theater of calculated invisibility. The heiress, still consumed by her obsession with dominance, paced the halls, issuing commands with sharp precision. Her eyes searched for resistance, her ears strained for whispers, but the network beneath her had learned the art of invisibility. Every action she took was anticipated, neutralized, or inverted without her knowledge. Her power remained visible, but its efficacy had dissolved. The servants and overseers, trained by her own methods of manipulation, moved with silent intelligence. They obeyed, yet their obedience was tailored to shift outcomes away from her will. A chore completed incorrectly, a schedule delayed, a report subtly altered, each act small, imperceptible, yet cumulatively devastating. The heiress' paranoia deepened. She saw threats in the ordinary, a glance held too long, a sigh too soft, a shadow that lingered. Her mind, once sharp and dominant, had become a labyrinth of fear and doubt. She questioned reality itself. Her journals reflected the descent. They move as one, unseen. They anticipate every action. I am the predator, yet I feel hunted. Is my empire real, or am I a prisoner in a house of mirrors? The environment mirrored her psychological collapse. Doors resisted her touch. Candles flickered in patterns she could not interpret. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners. Even the animals, once obedient, moved with heightened awareness, reacting to patterns invisible to her. She attempted one final strategy: over-control. Public punishment. Sudden crises. Arbitrary alterations of routine. But each move played directly into the network's hands. Her interventions only reinforced the invisible coordination, amplifying her fear and exhaustion. By evening, the heiress' body ached. Her mind was fragmented. Sleep, food, and clarity had vanished. She was trapped in a psychological snare of her own design, unable to distinguish cause from effect. This is the terrifying reality of absolute control. The tools you create to dominate can be learned, adapted, and turned against you. The heiress had trained minds to anticipate, obey, and manipulate, and now those trained minds moved as one, dismantling her empire silently, invisibly, irreversibly. The first overt fracture of her dominion was only hours away, and the heiress, consumed by her own obsession and fear, remained blissfully unaware that the network she ignored was about to strike. The first overt fracture came quietly, like a ripple on a still pond. The heiress, convinced that her authority was absolute, had gathered her overseers for a midday inspection. She expected obedience, visible fear, and immediate compliance. Instead, she found precision in subtle rebellion. Tasks were executed flawlessly, but in ways that undermined her authority. Her orders were followed, yes, but the outcomes favored the invisible network, not her will. She did not immediately recognize it. Arrogance blinded her. Years of orchestrating control had created a psychological echo chamber in which she believed all outcomes were predictable. But the invisible coordination she had nurtured now operated beyond her perception. A simple gesture, a misaligned tool, a misfiled document, a delayed response, was repeated strategically across the estate. To an untrained observer, it was negligible. To her, it was frustratingly subtle, untraceable, and humiliating. Her fury rose, yet each outburst only confirmed the mastery of those she sought to dominate. By mid-afternoon, she attempted direct confrontation. A group of overseers was summoned. Questions were asked sharply, orders repeated with venom, punishments threatened. Yet nothing disrupted the cohesion of the network beneath her. Every act of intimidation was absorbed, catalogued, and counted without overt rebellion. Her influence, once uncontested, had slipped silently through her fingers. Her confidence faltered. Her paranoia escalated. Her journals, once precise, became frantic scribbles. They see everything. They anticipate. They move as one. Am I imagining this? Am I losing control? I cannot bend them. They are not mine. By evening, the heiress' body and mind were fatigued beyond recognition. She could no longer predict outcomes. She could no longer trust her perception. The invisible network, trained and disciplined by her own methods, had taken command, not through force, but through silent coordination, subtlety, and patience. This is a lesson few history books record. Absolute power can be dismantled without swords, without bloodshed, without rebellion. Observation, anticipation, and unity are enough to topple even the most meticulous tyrant. And the heiress, drunk on her own genius and blinded by arrogance, was about to learn that lesson in its most brutal, psychological form. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding, and the heiress had yet to understand that the final stage of reckoning was already underway. Night descended over the plantation, thick and oppressive, mirroring the heiress' state of mind. She moved through the halls with an air of fragile authority, expecting every action to bend to her will. But the invisible network beneath her had long since learned to move in synchrony without detection. Every glance she cast, every word she spoke, every gesture she made was anticipated, catalogued, and counted silently. She tried to reclaim dominance through spectacle, a sudden inspection, arbitrary punishment, abrupt changes in routine. But each effort backfired. Tasks were completed, yes, but in ways that subtly shifted power away from her. Her empire of fear had become a system that operated independently of her control. Her paranoia intensified. She questioned loyalty, intentions, and even reality itself. Shadows seemed to move against her. Whispers that did not exist filled her ears. Even objects in the manor appeared misaligned deliberately, taunting her perception. By midnight, exhaustion and terror had fused into a singular, oppressive weight. Her mind was fractured. Sleep had become impossible. Her journals reflected this breakdown. I cannot see them. I cannot predict them. They anticipate me. I am trapped in my own designs. Have I created something that no longer answers to me? The heiress had underestimated one immutable principle. Those trained to obey can also be trained to resist silently. Her years of psychological mastery had created an intelligence network beneath her, a system of observation, anticipation, and subtle subversion she could not perceive. The estate, once a reflection of her will, now mirrored her unraveling. The air was thick with unspoken coordination. The shadows, the flicker of candlelight, even the creak of floorboards seemed imbued with intent. She was no longer the predator. She was the prey. And here lies the dark lesson. Absolute power can collapse from within, not through violence, but through subtle, disciplined resistance. The heiress had mastered fear, manipulation, and control. And yet, the very mechanisms she perfected were now being applied against her, silently, invisibly, and relentlessly. The final stage was approaching. Her empire, her mind, and her will were about to confront a truth that few survived psychologically, that control is an illusion, and that the human spirit, when united, cannot be bent indefinitely. The heiress reckoning was imminent. The heiress world had become a theater of shadows and anticipation. By now, she no longer trusted her own eyes or ears. Every glance, every movement, every whispered word was filtered through fear and obsession. She suspected betrayal at every turn, but the invisible network beneath her never gave her the clarity to strike. It only operated silently, flawlessly, consistently. Her empire, once a system of absolute domination, now existed independently of her will. Orders were followed, but their outcomes served the subtle intelligence moving beneath the surface. The estate was alive, not in submission, but in a synchronized, invisible coordination that rendered her influence meaningless. She attempted overt control, a public reprimand here, a sudden change in schedules there, but every effort only reinforced the network's mastery. The heiress had trained her servants to anticipate, manipulate, and calculate. Now those skills were turned against her, weaponized with precision. Her paranoia had reached a fever pitch. She moved through corridors with caution, checking shadows, listening for imaginary whispers, examining every face for signs of conspiracy. Her mind, once sharp and commanding, had become a labyrinth of terror and doubt. The environment itself seemed to respond. Doors resisted her touch. Candles flickered unnaturally. Shadows pulled where they should not. Even the animals mirrored the tension in the air, skittish and unpredictable. By early morning, The heiress' physical and psychological exhaustion was complete. She could no longer distinguish cause from effect. Every manipulation she attempted was anticipated. Every order she gave had consequences she could not predict. This is the ultimate truth of power. Absolute dominion can be undone without swords, without blood, without rebellion. Silent coordination, patience, and awareness are sufficient to dismantle tyranny. The heiress had lived her life as a master of fear, and now she was a victim of it. The tools she had perfected, obedience, anticipation, psychological manipulation, had been turned against her. Her empire, once a reflection of her will, was now a prison of her own making. The next few hours would mark the climactic unraveling. The heiress' reckoning was no longer imminent. It was here. The invisible force she ignored was ready to demonstrate its full power. The final collapse began quietly, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. The heiress, exhausted and fractured, attempted one last assertion of control. She summoned her overseers, demanded explanations, and threatened punishment. Her voice, once commanding and feared, now trembled with paranoia. She no longer projected authority. She radiated tension. Every move she made was anticipated. Every command she issued, every gesture, every glance, all absorbed, catalogued, and redirected by the invisible network she had trained but never comprehended. Her empire of fear, which had once bowed to her whim, now operated autonomously, subtly undermining her at every turn. Small acts of defiance, seemingly inconsequential, compounded into irreversible fractures. Tasks performed incorrectly subtly, deliberately misaligned schedules, delayed communications. Each minor deviation weakened her authority, like water eroding stone. She could see the cracks, but she could not understand the architecture behind them. By noon, she had reached the peak of psychological exhaustion. Her body, already heavy, a symbol of both indulgence and isolation, bore the tension of constant vigilance. Her mind, once sharp and cunning, was consumed by fear, doubt, and obsession. She scribbled frantically in her journals, diagrams of cause and effect she could no longer trace. They anticipate me. I cannot bend them. I am trapped in the system I created. The network, disciplined and patient, waited for no violent confrontation. There was no rebellion, no uprising. Only the slow, relentless assertion of collective awareness, an invisible pressure that exposed the heiress' vulnerabilities. Her manipulation, her cruelty, her arrogance, all of it turned against her. By late afternoon, the heiress realized the devastating truth. She had built her power on fear, and fear can be inverted. She had trained minds to obey, but she had never accounted for obedience turned strategic, patience turned weaponized. She had created a system to dominate, and that system had learned to dominate her in return. And here lies the darkest lesson of history. Absolute power is a fragile illusion. Those who seem powerless can dismantle empires quietly, invisibly, and with precision. Tyranny can be undone without swords, without blood, and without chaos, through awareness, patience, and unity alone. The heiress' reckoning had arrived. Her empire of fear had become her prison, and she was trapped inside it, helpless against the intelligence she had inadvertently cultivated. The heiress' descent was complete. By evening, the full weight of her empire's betrayal had settled on her. She moved through the halls like a ghost, a ruler without command, a predator trapped in the web it had spun. Every glance, every gesture, every action she attempted was anticipated, absorbed, and neutralized. Her servants and overseers, silent and precise, executed the networks were without open rebellion. Her authority existed only as illusion, a shadow of its former power. She had mastered fear, cruelty, and manipulation, but the very principles she perfected had been inverted against her. Her psychological empire, designed to dominate minds, had become her own cage. Every act of paranoia, every attempt to punish or manipulate, only tightened the invisible bonds around her. By nightfall, she could no longer differentiate reality from illusion. Shadows seemed sentient. Whispers felt deliberate. The house, the grounds, even the flicker of candlelight became extensions of the network she had ignored. Her body, heavy and exhausted, mirrored her mind, burdened, trapped, collapsing under the weight of inevitability. Her journals, once precise and commanding, were filled with fragmented thoughts, repeated questions, and obsessive diagrams. I am the hunter. I am the master. I am the predator. And yet, I am the prey. Everything I built turned against me. I see them everywhere, and nowhere. I cannot escape the system I created. The ultimate lesson of her life, and of this dark history, is stack. Absolute power is always fragile. Fear can be inverted. Obedience can be weaponized. Those who seem powerless, when coordinated and patient, can dismantle empires silently, invisibly, irreversibly. The heiress had believed herself untouchable, above consequence. She had trained minds, shaped behaviors, orchestrated terror. Yet she had never considered the intelligence of those she sought to dominate. And in that blindness, she fell. Her empire was gone, not through fire, not through blood, not through rebellion, but through the quiet, precise unraveling of human awareness and coordination. And she, the woman who once held dominion over all, was left to face the final, irreversible truth. The most dangerous power is not the one you wield, but the one you fail to perceive. The heiress had become a cautionary shadow in history, a reminder that tyranny, no matter how meticulous, is never eternal, and that the most profound revolutions are often invisible, silent, and irreversible. The house fell silent, the shadows waited, and history recorded only the echo of fear and the intelligence that turned it against its master. The story ends, but its lesson lingers, forever.